So I think I've always tried to live and to think in many worlds. Um, I draw from phenomenology, I draw from mythology, from psychology, um, from philosophy, from cognitive science, from neurology, um, from poetry. And I really, though, aside from poetry, which in some sense may be foundational to anything else that I might try to say, um, but for the most part, I don't feel quite at home in any of these traditions because let's say, phenomenologically, instead of talking about consciousness, we would have to talk about speech or writing or various concrete forms of speech or writing and what's associated with them. But to talk about consciousness, I mean, Husserl talked about consciousness, and I guess he was the father of phenomenology, but in a modern or postmodern or contemporary setting, it seems like phenomenology refers to just describing what shows itself. And consciousness doesn't show itself. Consciousness is a nothing, which it's nothingness. It's the void in which everything else arises, which is sort of what you come to realize performing Cartesian-like meditation, or performing some sort of Advaita Vedanta meditation, where you, well, I guess the non-dual school would actually not want to say that you are not this, not that, not that. Or they would say that Brahman is all, so maybe Brahman is not this or that in particular, but the whole, so maybe they would agree. But my point being that I would like to talk about consciousness and not just speech or writing or something that can be described, something that shows itself. I think we can also talk about that which doesn't show itself. Most of the meaning of language is not present in the words which are explicitly used, but in the relationships that those explicitly used words, the relationships that they open up between other words which haven't been spoken yet. The only way someone can respond to what you have said is if you've called attention to words unsaid. So in that way, words are always pointing to something absent, but in so doing, calling forth that absence from the other, or even from ourselves. But all of this is to say that in talking about consciousness, it's difficult to find someone saying anything more than what's already obvious, like David Chalmers, for example, important philosopher, I think. And then who's the other guy that I'm trying to mention associated with the hard problem of consciousness and the notion that for materialism, it's not only a hard problem, it's an insoluble problem. Either you have a dualism, two sorts of substances, two kinds of energies, or we have to completely reevaluate the materialistic understanding of the universe. That's what the hard problem basically leaves us with. And so that doesn't, I think Chalmers doesn't necessarily tell me more than what should be obvious already. If I really want to know about consciousness, it seems that I've had to turn to people like Rudolf Steiner, who studies people like Meister Eckhart and Giordano Bruno and Nicholas of Cusa, Jakob Burma, and it really is, I think, carrying on the philosophical spirit of Hegel and the scientific spirit of Goethe, and giving it even more modern interpretation. And I wanted to read a little bit about this important distinction whenever we're trying to study or understand or participate in consciousness, which is also always an evolution of consciousness. If we agree that consciousness is an intelligence of some kind, then an intelligence in the world is always trying to perfect itself or trying to complete itself. Otherwise it wouldn't be intelligence, and so it wouldn't be conscious. But this distinction between inside and outside seems really relevant to consciousness. It's the fact that we can make that distinction, I think, is what forces us to have to talk about this strange non-present, in the sense that it's immaterial and invisible, stuff called consciousness, or process of evolution called consciousness. And I wanted to read what Steiner has to say about this distinction and how we shouldn't mistake it for an ontological distinction, and so we can avoid dualism, but we also shouldn't then simply reduce everything to what's called matter. Because for physics, matter is that which can be observed and measured, that which has mass. Though light can be observed, kind of. We're not sure if it's a wave or a particle. It has no mass, no charge, but we can still talk about it. So already physics is admitting something that's kind of immaterial. But for the most part, matter is just what can be seen, can be felt, what has weight, and what can be counted or measured in some way, which requires some sort of physical impact of a surface to another surface in order to be measured. We can't simply reduce reality to that. There is something invisible, it's consciousness. So let's hear what Steiner has to say about this inside and outside distinction. Where do I start? If people are not allowed to add anything to sensory perception through higher cognition, which would be consciousness, this ability to be in the world and to intelligently participate in its further unfolding, which would imply you have some modicum of freedom, spontaneity, and creativity as a conscious being. This is the higher cognition that Steiner's talking about. If people are not allowed to add anything to sensory perception through higher cognition, but express only what exists as given by the outside world, this really means renouncing all higher cognition. With regard to sensory life, human beings are entities among other entities and attain higher cognition only when, as sensory beings, they transform themselves into higher beings. It follows that they can never replace one cognition with the other. Rather, spiritual life is made up of a perpetual back and forth movement between two poles of cognition, between knowing and seeing. If people were to shut themselves off from seeing, they would forego the nature of things. If they were to shut themselves off from sensory knowing, they would deprive themselves of the things whose nature they wanted to understand. The same things reveal themselves to the lower understanding and to the higher seeing, but at one time in terms of external appearance, and at another time with regard to an inner essence. It is not inherent to the nature of things that they appear only as external objects at a certain stage. Rather, this happens because people must first transform themselves to the point where the things of the world cease to have only an external reality. It is only with these considerations in mind that certain views elaborated by natural science during the 19th century appear in their proper light. Adherents of those views would say, quote, "We hear, see, and touch the things of the material world through the senses. The eye, for example, communicates a light phenomenon, a color. We say that a body gives off red light when, through the medium of our eyes, we experience the sensation red. But in other cases, the eye gives us another sensation. If the eye is struck or pressed, or if an electric current passes through the head, the eye experiences a sensation of light. When we have the sensation that a body gives off a certain color of light, something may be happening in that body that does not in any way resemble color. Regardless of what is occurring in the outer world, as long as the process can make an impression upon the eye, a sensation of color arises. Our perception arises in us because our organs are constituted in a certain way. Occurrences in the outer world remain outside us. We know only the effects that external processes produce within us. Hermann Helmholtz, who lived from 1821 to 1894, expressed this idea in a clearly defined way. Quote, "Our perceptions are effects produced in our organs by external causes. The way those effects manifest depends substantially on the kind of apparatus they work on. Insofar as the quality of our perceptions provides information that characterizes the external influences that created it, one may consider it to be an indication of the influence, but not a representation of it. We require an image to be somewhat similar to the object represented. We likewise require a similarity of form in a statue, a similarity of perspective in the field of view of a drawing, and, in addition to the perspective, a similarity of colors in a painting. But a sign needs no resemblance to the external object. The relationship between the two is limited. The same object, given the same circumstances, must evoke the same sign. Accordingly, unlike signs always correspond to unlike influences. If, in the course of ripening, berries of a certain variety develop both a red pigment and sugar, then red color and sweet taste will always be found together in our perception of berries of this kind." So Steiner narrates, "Now, let us follow step by step the train of thought adopted by this view. A process is assumed to occur in the outer world. It produces an effect on my sensory organ. My nervous system transmits the resulting impression to my brain, and another process is produced there. I now perceive red. It is said that, therefore, the perception of the color red is not outside me, but within me. All our perceptions are only signs of external processes, the true nature of which we know nothing. We live and act among our perceptions and know nothing of their origin." In line with this way of thinking, we can also say that if we had no eyes, there would be no color. Nothing would then transform the external process, which is unknown to us, into the perception red. This train of thought is seductive to many people. Nevertheless, it is based on a complete misrepresentation or misinterpretation of the facts under consideration. In parentheses, he writes, "If many contemporary natural scientists and philosophers were not seriously deluded by this way of thinking, we would not need to speak about it so much. But this delusion has, in fact, corrupted contemporary thinking in many ways. Because we are entities among other entities, the things of the world must make an impression upon us if we are to discover anything about them. A process outside the human being must give lead to a process within us if red is to appear in the field of our vision. One must only ask, What is outside and what is inside? Outside is a process in space and time. But inside, there is certainly a similar process. Such a process exists in the eye and communicates itself to the brain when I perceive red. I cannot directly observe the process that takes place inside any more than I can directly perceive in the outer world the motion of light waves, which physicists believe correspond to the color red. It is only in this sense, however, that I can speak of outer and inner qualities. Only in terms of sensory perception does the differentiation between outside and inside have any validity. This perception leads me to assume a process of space-time in the outer world, though I cannot perceive it directly. Moreover, that same perception leads me to assume such a process exists within me, which I am also unable to perceive directly. But I also assume other spatio-temporal processes in ordinary life, which I cannot perceive directly. For example, I hear a piano player in the next room, and assume that a human being, having spatial dimensions, sits at the piano and plays. My way of representing matters to myself is the same, whether I speak of processes within me or outside me. I assume that the characteristics of such processes are analogous to qualities of those processes perceived by my senses, but that, for certain reasons, they are inaccessible to my direct observation. If I were to deny that these processes involved all the qualities my senses revealed to me in the realm of space and time, it would be like the proverbial knife without a handle whose blade is missing. I can say only that spatio-temporal processes take place in the outer world and that they give rise to spatio-temporal processes within me. Both are necessary if red is to appear in my field of vision. Insofar as it is not spatio-temporal, it would be useless to look for this red, whether outside or inside. If natural scientists and philosophers cannot find red in the outer world, neither should they attempt to look for it within. It is not inside in the same sense that it is not outside. To say that everything the sensory world presents to us is really an inner world of perceptions, and to look for something external that corresponds to it is an impossible concept. Consequently, we cannot say that red, sweet, hot, and so on are indications to which something very different in the outer world corresponds, and that as such they rise only within us. In fact, the effect produced within us as the result of an external process is quite different from what appears in the field of our perception. If we want to refer to what arises in us as signs, we can say that those signs appear within our organism as a way to communicate perceptions that, in their immediacy, are neither inside nor outside us. Rather, they belong to that common world of which my external world and my interior world are only parts. It is true that, if I wish to grasp that common realm, I must rise to the higher level of cognition that recognizes neither inside nor outside. So, for Steiner, consciousness is that aspect of the world process, of the cosmic process of space and time. Consciousness is that aspect which is, in a sense, free. And so, like our experience of redness, or hotness, temperature, or beauty of any kind, all of these so-called subjective qualities, though it may be useful to call them subjective in the sense that consciousness is participating in their emergence, they're no less objective. And so Steiner is trying to overcome the Kantian dualism between phenomena and things and real beings. And to do that, he has to say that really this distinction between inside and outside is a form of conceptualizing the world devised by and understood by consciousness. And consciousness is neither inside nor outside, but a free participant in the ongoing construction of the world, of the universe. And I think, we say, well, what does that mean? That your mind is projecting the physical world? No, it means that the physical world is your mind. It's still there. It's just as real as it's always been, but you participate in making it. Our understanding of space-time is the universe understanding itself as space-time. So, as our knowledge of it increases, as our consciousness expands, so does the universe. Indeed, that is what we observe.